Well, today we're going to be talking about Plato's ethics. We're going to be discussing his conception of virtue and contrasting it with Socrates. Now, in order to explain what's going on here, I need to back up and tell you a little more about Plato's work. Socrates himself wrote nothing, but he appears as a character in the dialogues of Plato. And those dialogues are generally divided by scholars into three groups. There are the early dialogues, which have the form of philosophies, basically. They involve discussions of what courage or friendship or love or piety or some other virtue happens to be. Then, and as far as we can tell, although this is nothing like a transcript of conversations that actually happened, these are literary works, nevertheless, we think that the positions put forward there are the positions of the historical Socrates. Now, Socrates never directly advocates a position. He never comes out and says, here's my view of virtue. But you can get a sense of what his position must be in the background as he attacks the definitions put forward by others. And that's confirmed by Aristotle, who discusses the Socratic view at a number of points and describes it as the underlying view you find in those early dialogues. Now, Aristotle evidently didn't meet Socrates, but he studied with Plato, who was closely associated with Socrates. So presumably, he learned, if not from the horse's mouth, at least from the horse's student's mouth, what Socrates thought. And so we are pretty confident that these early dialogues reflect the views of the historical Socrates. Now, in the middle dialogue period, including the Republic, which we're going to be talking about today, it looks as if Plato is putting forward different views. Plato here, it's thought, is putting forward his own view. And Socrates in these dialogues plays a very different role. He actually advocates positions. He doesn't just sit back and critique. He does quite a bit of that. But occasionally he actually seems to step forward and give his own view of justice, for example, in the Republic. And so scholars generally think that's Plato's view. He's distancing himself in those middle dialogues from Socrates. And then in the later dialogues, Socrates actually is either just kind of a mouthpiece for Plato, or he disappears entirely, or he's just a minor character, and actually people, like the Eleatic stranger in one of the dialogues, are pointing out what's wrong with Socrates' views. So today we're going to be really contrasting that early dialogue view that seems to be there in Socrates and reflecting the actual historical Socrates' opinions, and then Plato's voice as it emerges in the middle dialogues, and his different conception of virtue. Well, remember that Socrates had put forward this view of the unity of the virtues. His idea was that in the end, all the virtues come to the same thing. What is courage? It's the knowledge of the grounds of fear and confidence, but those are directed toward the future, and there's no such thing as knowledge specifically of the future. So really that's just a matter of knowing good and evil, knowing what to do and what not to do. And so it turns out to be wisdom. But actually, it emerges in other of the early dialogues that everything turns out to be that way. In other words, you can give a similar kind of argument for all of these other virtues, for piety, for generosity, for temperance, for prudence, for love, for friendship, and so on. All of them, in the end, come down to knowing what to do and what not to do, knowing good and evil. And so in the end, it turns out all of the virtues are the same. All of them amount to knowing good and evil, knowing what's better than what. Now, if you think about this for a moment, you might think, wait, that's a little bit of a strange view and a very bold view, because it implies that you can't really have one of these virtues without having them all. You can't really be courageous without also being wise and self-controlled and generous and so forth. And yet, intuitively speaking, it feels as if even if there is some common core to the virtues, and there might be certain things that are just required for anybody to have any virtue. But still, you might think it's more like this. Maybe some of them overlap, but nevertheless, it looks as if intuitively you could be generous without being courageous, for example. Or you could be self-controlled, temperate, without being, let's say, very prudent. And so the idea is, can these come apart? Could we take somebody who has some virtue, but not others? And can you think of examples of people who would be like that? Exhibit one virtue, but lack another virtue. Yeah.
Does this come into play whenever we talk about capacities for virtues? Like, you have the capacity to play the piano, but you don't have the ability to play the piano. So, if somebody has this core of wisdom and they exhibit courage, but they don't exhibit generosity? Have they just not maybe developed their generosity level yet?
Okay, you might think that actually the same capacities are involved for all for all of the virtues, but nevertheless that they get developed to different degrees. So we were just talking about that distinction between your capacity and then your actual development of that capacity into a talent, into an ability. And so one way of looking at this would be to say, well, we have to draw a distinction. Are we saying that the capacities for all the virtues are the same, or that the abilities to act in accordance with these virtues are all the same? Or is it a matter of tendencies? Is a virtue a matter not just of having a capacity or ability, but a disposition, a tendency to behave in a certain way? So those things are going to matter. And you could argue that maybe the capacity is really the same, getting applied in different cases, but that they have different degrees of development. Or you could say tendencies can be different. So even though one person has the capacity to be generous, let's say, they don't exercise it and they don't actually usually behave generously. So you're right, this is a complicated question, and when we think about unity, we should really draw that distinction and think. Unity of capacities, unity of abilities, unity of dispositions. What exactly is a virtue, and where do we place it on that scale? But let's come back to the more intuitive question. Think about whether you could be courageous, for example, without being generous. Yeah?
Work in your own self-interest, so you're courageous, maybe just for what you want, but not for what others need.
Suppose somebody is courageous in the sense that they bravely pursue their own self-interest, but on the other hand, they don't seem to exhibit much concern for other people. Would that person be courageous, but let's say not generous? Yeah?
Like an example of that could be a king who conquers other kingdoms but doesn't care for his subjects.
Oh, a king who conquers other kingdoms but does not care for his subjects. That king might exhibit various virtues, including martial virtues like courage, but on the other hand, not exhibit them toward the people, and so lack other virtues. Yeah?
Like, not even the case where, like, generosity could be, like, an option. Like, if you're, like, defending yourself, like, from a bear attack, like, generosity doesn't even factor into that. It's an act of courage, I suppose, but, you know, generosity doesn't even register.
Okay, yes, a bear attacks you, and you fight back. You fight back courageously. But his point is, generosity, piety, and so on, do not really figure into what's going on there in any way, right? It looks like that's completely independent. Wouldn't people look for reasons for courage, you said? Okay, now that's an interesting idea. You might say, wait a minute, the person who is courageous might be fighting off the bear very bravely and so on. What are they concerned about? Well, in that case, it might be their own life. Or the person who is brave in battle but strictly for his or her own glory is somebody who is really, you might say, not doing it for a reason that would include other things. But think about a more typical case of courage. Somebody is fighting bravely or standing up bravely for something they believe that's for a greater good. And if you think about that, you would think, well then, something crucial is going on here, some appreciation for a greater good. In fact, last time one of you said, I think courage is really a matter of overcoming fear for the sake of some greater good. And that would make it sound as if, wait a minute, it is doing it for the sake of something larger, even if that something larger in a particular case is your own survival. And so, from that point of view, you might say, well, that virtue requires, then, some understanding of that greater good, but maybe the same thing is true of generosity. You sacrifice something of your own to help someone else, for in this case, their good, but that's part of that greater good. And the same thing, self-control. You're resisting your own desires for the sake of a greater good. And so I can imagine an argument here that actually in the end all of them point at least to a core of some appreciation for the greater good. Now, if we stop and think about Socrates' definition from another point of view, and here we can think about courage or wisdom or whatever, but let's just focus on courage as the knowledge of good and evil. We were setting things up in this sort of way, and really it's for virtue as a whole, as indicated there. He's claiming that virtue is a matter of knowing good and evil. Now, is that right? Even if we think of virtue as a whole, is that the right characterization? Could you exhibit virtue without knowing good and evil? And could you know good and evil without exhibiting virtue? So let's think about, first case, whether this is too narrow, whether you could be virtuous without a knowledge of good and evil. Yeah?
Maybe like some children sharing their toys, or just because they know it's the right thing to do.
Oh, some child, well now you undercut your own case. You said, what about a child who shares their toys because they know it's the right thing to do? If they're doing it because they know it's the right thing to do, then it does involve knowledge of good and evil, so it would fall right into Socrates' wheelhouse. We would have to have that child who just behaves nicely and kindly and generously, let's say, and so forth, without knowing good and evil, just because it's in their nature. So are some people just naturally good? Just naturally. I mean, look, I was a very happy, good baby. At least I am told. I don't remember. But I am told I was very easy to take care of. I mean, I was always just kind of I didn't cry much, I didn't fuss, and so on. I did go through a stage in the terrible twos where I held my breath until I would pass out if I didn't get what I wanted, but it turned out my mother put a stop to that very quickly. She just let me pass out. And when I fell to the floor, I got hurt, and I never did that again. Anyway, but you might say, look, a baby like that, who just behaves in some of these ways, but naturally, it's just a natural disposition. There's no knowledge of good and evil there, unless you think the baby is born knowing that. It's just their natural tendency. And there might be other kind of cases where behavior like this is just automatic for somebody. It's not because they have an acquaintance with the greater good. It's just what they tend to do. It's just their personality. Yeah?
I guess that's pretty like contrary to like Kant's interpretation of morals, where you have to have that knowledge of like intention behind your acts for it to be moral.
Good. We're later going to get to Kant, and there it's crucial that you have the right kind of intention. The person who is good, he says, is the person with a good will, and that means having a good intention. So somebody who does this without specifically thinking about it wouldn't count as necessarily very good from Kant's point of view. And so you could argue that, yeah, that person isn't really virtuous. Admittedly, they behave virtuously in the sense that they do what a virtuous person would do quite frequently. But you could argue it's not really virtue because it's not something developed, it's not something intended. Yeah?
Going along with that, someone could be doing something generous, for example, out of wanting mutual reciprocation. So they give in order to receive.
Okay, good. Good. Remember in writing that paper, I told you, focus on a moral quality of a person or of an action, but don't try to do both, you'll get confused. This is a place where it's easy to get confused because indeed, if we think about a generous action, for example, you might think that it's really just a matter of helping somebody in need out. But if you think about a virtuous person, you can imagine somebody who does that thing, right, commits acts that appear to be virtuous and appear to be generous, but actually is not a generous person, thinks that they're doing it because they hope that somebody will bail them out. So if it's, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, that's not really generosity. It's a form of cooperation, but it may not exhibit this virtue. You wanted to get in a moment ago.
Yes, I was just saying, I think even if you have a knowledge, it doesn't necessarily mean you can have virtue unless it's enforced by a supervisor. Because if you know Lord of the Flies, the kids are well behaved, but when they're left to survive on their own, even though they have the knowledge, they don't have someone enforcing that knowledge of good and evil, so it all becomes chaos.
Ooh, okay, good. He's talking now about the other issues. That is to say, could you know good and evil and yet not be virtuous? And his example is Lord of the Flies. The kids might know what virtue is, but leave them alone out in the woods, and all of a sudden, all sorts of terrible things start happening. They don't behave virtuously at all. And you could argue, look, they know what's right and wrong, but the fact is all of that goes out the window and they stop behaving that way. Yeah?
I would say yes, because most of us here and throughout history do, but if you look at Machiavelli, and friends, it might be in our best interest to not be virtuous because we think it's for our security or we'll get some future benefit, it was an opportunity cost to be virtuous or doing something to get A, you might say oh.
Ooh. Okay, good. What happens often is we might know good and evil. We might know what the greater good is, but we put our own good, our own selfish good ahead of the greater good. And in a case like that, you might say what's happening is really not that we don't know good and evil. Now Socrates would say, well, actually you don't know good and evil. You don't know that good is greater than your own personal good. But the response would be, yes, you do. You just put your own personal good ahead of it. Yeah.
I think under this example, you look at virtue as something like a computer and you evaluate like if it's good or bad. Whereas like I like the idea of Aristotle and Confucius more, where you're the virtuous type of person and you do what the virtuous type of person does. Like you have the ability to act virtuously because you've practiced it. And
Okay, good.
it's not like you just decide and everything like, are you going to act virtuously or not? You have to have the ability to act virtuously, and that comes from practice.
All right, nice, nice, nice. Think about the following sort of thing. You might know good and evil, but Aristotle would say that doesn't make you virtuous. What makes you virtuous is developing the habit in such a way that it becomes second nature to behave that way. And so the knowledge isn't sufficient. You've got to presumably know what to do, or maybe you do, but in any event, you've got to develop the right habits. And that has to be put into practice. So one way of looking at this is to say, look, knowing good and evil isn't enough to make you virtuous. You've got to put it into practice. You've got to behave that way. And so, yeah, well, here's what Socrates has to say. You can't be virtuous without knowing good and evil, but also you can't know good and evil without being virtuous. And yet, what if you have the knowledge without the habits? What if you have the knowledge without the behavior? So what if, for example, you're the soldier there at your post, the enemy is attacking, you know that the right thing to do is to remain at your post, you know that the thing to do is to be courageous, and for the great sake of the greater good, accept the risk to your own personal safety, and yet you run away. Okay? And while you're running away, you're saying, I know I should be staying behind. I know I should be staying back there. But you run away, right? You're the ethics professor who does that. A few years ago, there was a shooter on campus. Someone in our department was teaching a dialogue, the Phaedo, in which Socrates is explaining why you should not fear death. And all of a sudden, over the loudspeakers came this announcement: the campus is on lockdown. There is an active shooter on campus. My friend shouted to his class, "You're on your own," and ran out of the classroom. Okay? Now, he's saying, death is not to be feared, and he's saying, I know what the right thing to do is, or at least he's acting as if he has this virtue, and yet the moment the chips are down, he runs away. And you might think that's possible. You could have the knowledge without the practice. There's a very general phenomenon here, which is referred to in the literature as weakness of will. It's a matter of actually having the strength of will to do what you think you ought to do. And so a person who is weak of will knows what they ought to do, but doesn't do it. So you might worry that there's a contrast here between knowledge and action. It's not enough to know what to do, you have to actually do it. And other thing, there could be all sorts of reasons why that knowledge doesn't get put into practice. But whatever the reason is, there's going to, in the end, be something that prevents you from acting on your knowledge. So here's the idea. Weakness of will is a matter of giving in to temptation. It's a matter of, as one person put it, knowing the better and doing the worse. Knowing what you ought to do, and yet not doing it. Now it seems like that's possible. There are all sorts of times when people give in to temptation, when they experience weakness of will. So let's think about that. A classic statement is in Paul, the book of Romans. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. And so Paul is saying, look, I feel like I know what I want to do, I know what I ought to do, and yet I find myself not doing it. And so he concludes, I am a stranger to myself, I'm alien to myself. Somehow I cannot bring myself to do what I know I ought to do. Well, if that's possible, we're in trouble. So here's a simple example. I know I should exercise, okay? And yet, let's say I don't. I don't want to exercise. Knowing the better, yes, I know I should. But doing the worse, I don't. I think, man, I ought to go to the gym. But then I think, wait, I could hunt Pokemon. And so I don't, right? And what do we think about such a case? Well, it seems like I have the knowledge, and yet I don't put it into practice. Socrates does have a response. Socrates would say, well, wait a minute. I claim that in a case like that, you don't really know the better thing to do. You don't really know what you ought to do. If you did, you'd do it. Why? Well, here. You're in effect evaluating, right, the short-term pleasure of trying to catch a Pokemon with the long-term good of your own health. Now, what's the greater good there? Your own health. And yet you go follow the Pokemon. And so in a case like that, you would say, you're in fact not knowing what is the better thing to do. So you would say, look, what's happening here, blah, blah, blah. Why do I keep going on about this? There we go. Okay. Here's the whole idea. If you choose the worst thing, it's because at that moment at least you think it's better. You think that that's the better option. So the difficulty here is, I mean, how can you do that? If you say, wait, the enjoyment of this versus your own health, come on, what's more important? The person might answer correctly. However, here is why it's so hard. Socrates says, look, we often make these misjudgments, and they are misjudgments. All vice is ignorance. All virtue turns out to be knowledge for Socrates. That means all vice is ignorance. And how can we be ignorant of such a thing? He says, because it's hard to compare short-term and long-term goods. The pleasure of catching the Pokemon is a short-term thing. It's immediate. The pleasure of greater health as a result of exercising, that may be a long-term thing. And so if we think about these cases of temptation, it's almost always a case of this short-term good versus that long-term good. And that's a hard thing to make a comparison about. We're often wrong about it. And so Socrates says, look, it's not that far-fetched to think it's really a case of ignorance. We don't know how to compare the short-term and the long-term considerations. There's a Marshmellow Test that psychologists have performed. They give children a marshmallow, and then they say, I'm going to be back in 10 minutes. And if you haven't eaten the marshmallow by that time, I'll give you another marshmallow. And they find that some kids can resist the temptation of the marshmallow and will wait so they get a second marshmallow, but other kids wolf that marshmallow down. Can you delay gratification is the question. And they find it correlates with all sorts of other things, including success in life. But in any event, Socrates is saying, yeah, we suck at the Marshmellow Test, basically. We're not very good at delaying gratification. We're ignorant about how to compare those short-term and long-term goods. And look, it's not just because we're stupid. It's because there are all sorts of uncertainties about the future. Is that guy really going to return? You know, how long is that exactly? When will he return? Blah, blah, blah. And so it's complicated to make those judgments. And so what it amounts to is we're not very good at all of that. Ignorance reigns. Yeah?
I'd say I don't really agree with the ignorance thing because, like, in addict instance, they know what's good and desire to do it, but having their inner drives, they're not able to resist that, which is really the same thing as not knowing what to do, just not having the ability to overcome that.
Okay, good. An addict might be a different sort of case, where maybe, an addict who's trying to quit, right? The smoker who's trying to quit or something might be a good instance of this. But you're right, the average addict might not be like this. And indeed, there are lots of cases where you might say you give in to temptation, where you aren't really going through this. We'll talk more about those in a minute when we get to Plato's mature theory. Yeah?
Similar to the addict thing that he was talking about, I learned yesterday that from the Marshmellow Test, they were saying that there's correlations to heroin addiction and to alcoholism, like depending on how you, because they can't have, or they think instant gratification is more important than like getting more down the road or something.
Right. It is correlated with all sorts of things, including addiction. So whatever's going on in addiction, it does have something to do with this general ability to compare short-term and long-term goods. Yeah?
Do you think that could be, like, potentially tied to, like, income? Like, kid doesn't often get, like a little treat every now and again, so when they see it, they grab it, and because, parents are poor or whatever, and that leads to problems later on. Then they develop, it's more correlation than it is causation, like sort of like a...
Right.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an intriguing question. He's basically saying, look, maybe the ability on the Marshmellow Test correlates with all sorts of other things. For example, how many marshmallows does this kid get? A poor kid may not see many marshmallows, so it's like, hey, marshmallow in the hand is better than 2 in the promises of a psychologist. And that might be plausible for that person. Or it might be a question of trust. Has this person had experience of trusting relationships? So when the psychologist says, I'll be back and I'll give you another one, the kid believes him. Maybe if he's seen a lot of people he can't trust, he doesn't trust that statement and so doesn't believe it and so on. So yes, there can be all sorts of factors that promote this. And a crucial question for Socrates then is, how do we actually promote a greater ability here? How do we cure this kind of ignorance? And it's going to be a matter of trying to address whatever those causes are. Yeah, go ahead.
And in sort of like a roundabout way, what if that, like a different kid in the same test, didn't exert their will, they just like took a nap for 10 minutes until the person came back? Like, is it still virtue if they still didn't wait for it, but like, they didn't exert their willpower over it or anything?
That's a good question. I mean, what if the kid just falls asleep? It's like, I'm really tired. I have to do the psychological experiment. I'm too tired to eat it anyway. You're right. That wouldn't exactly be virtue. And the way that some of the kids deal with this, by the way, they walk to another part of the room. They try to avoid looking at the marshmallow, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many degrees of, you could say, dealing with the temptation here. Many degrees of sort of feeling it and then responding in different ways. Yeah.
Well, like, I know that a while ago my brother-in-law was trying to lose weight, and, he loves sweets. He just absolutely adores them. So I told him, you know what, every time before you eat whatever dessert you're going to pick out, like, literally put your hand back for a second and just think, what good is this going to do for me? Am I going to be happy after I eat it? Like, mentally happy, not taste buds happy.
Right.
And, like, what good is this going to bring me, and is it going to bring me closer to my goal? And, like, that actually had helped him for a little bit, because every time, like, he'd go to get dessert, he'd, like, think about these questions, and then he'd, like, kind of step back from it. And he'd feel like crap, because he didn't get to eat the food he wants to eat, but, like, it had helped him maintain that weight loss goal.
All right, good. If you start thinking about this question, like, how do you develop this? It might be partly a matter of obtaining knowledge, but it might be actually putting yourself in a situation where you do have to think about it. A lot of people will track their calorie intake, for example, as a dieting technique, and it's a similar kind of thing. You can't just eat that pretzel. You've got to eat the pretzel and track it, and it'll tell you how many calories it was. And at first that's pleasant, like, oh, that wasn't many at all. But then you hit something and you think, wait, what? And all of a sudden you feel the penalty of doing that, and it makes that knowledge much more immediate. So actually there might be a lot of things like pause and just think about this for a moment, or write down every time you give in, right? Don't just have that cigarette, don't just have that donut. You have to now write it down and admit to it. That's different. Well, let's look at the mature Platonic theory. We can talk about this one for a long time. Well, one more thing. Yes, go ahead.
Is what Socrates thinks a virtuous person is someone who is virtuous things by habit? Is that what he says?
No. Look, virtue is knowledge. Virtue is knowledge for Socrates, and that means vice is ignorance. Has nothing to do with habit, has nothing to do with action directly. And that's a surprising thing, right? You think the generous person acts in a certain way, the courageous person acts in a certain way. And yet notice, for Socrates, it's all internal, and that seems wrong. Now, Plato thinks there's something else wrong with it. When he gets to the Republic, he's saying, look, if we think about a case like this, a case of conflict, a case where somebody is trying to resist temptation, what's going on? He says the person with willpower resists his desires. A person who is weak of will gives in to them. A person in such a situation seems to be at war with himself. That idea that we're undergoing psychological conflict, we're at war with ourselves, is something crucial. That's something that Paul is reflecting in that statement in Romans. I feel at war with myself. I feel estranged from myself. And that is a Platonic point. I feel in conflict. Now, if it's a matter of, like Socrates, just being in a state of ignorance, why would I feel any sense of conflict? Suppose I offer you $5 or $10. Which would you choose? 10, right? Now, that's easy. Suppose you don't know. I say, aha, in one of these hands I have a $5 bill, in the other I have a $10 bill. Which hand should you choose? You'll feel uncertainty because you're not sure which hand the $10 bill is in, but you don't really feel psychological conflict. It's not like, oh, I so badly want to choose your right hand, but I also really badly want to choose. No, it's just uncertainty. It's not conflict. However, the kind of conflict we're talking about, Plato is saying, is not like that. It's not just uncertainty. It's really a matter of feeling torn between two kinds of goods. So consider a case of temptation like that. Okay? The dieter sitting there in front of donuts. Now, is it just like, oh, I'm not sure which is greater? It's not that she's experiencing uncertainty, she's experiencing conflict. She is at war with herself. Actually, she doesn't look very conflicted. But, I typed in donuts temptation, and that's not done. Anyway, the idea there is, look, you feel at war with yourself. You feel like, oh, I really would like that, but on the other hand, I shouldn't. Another case of conflict. The cat and the goldfish. Or this one, how I resist food temptations. I identify the food items I can't stop thinking about. Then I remove all sources of temptation by eating them. I are dumb. Yeah, that's kind of my dieting technique. Oh man, all the stuff around is going to tempt me. I better eat it now. Or that. That's a painting just entitled Temptation. That's, I guess, supposed to be Eve with the apple. Yeah, I don't really get it either, but I think it's a beautiful painting. Okay, so now here's Plato's question. How can something be at war with itself? How can I be at war with myself? I understand how, one country could be at war with another, how I could be at war with someone else I'm having a conflict with, but how can I be at war with myself? Plato says the same thing, cannot at the same time act and be acted upon in conflicting ways. And so it looks as if whenever a contradiction like that occurs, whenever you're at war with yourself, it turns out there have to be two things there. Okay? The things are not really the same but are different. One thing cannot be impelled this way and be impelled that way at the same time. So if you're feeling torn like that, it means there are two different things pulling at you. Two different sources, two different things that are actually trying to go in different directions. Well, what is conflict then? It is a conflict among these different parts of the soul. He concludes, it is not the case that you and I are psychologically unified. We are fragmented. We are broken into different parts of the soul, different psychological components, and they are fighting each other in such cases. Here is Homer with the devil on one shoulder, the angel on the other, the devil saying, eat the donut, or, why don't you have that cigarette, why don't you take a drink of alcohol, etc. And then on the other side, the angel saying no. Or in this case, the angel is the one actually saying, look, you ought to do this. And the devil is saying, I don't want to do this. Right? But you ought to study for that exam. But I don't feel like it. What are some cases of conflict that you experience where you really do feel at war with yourself? Where it doesn't feel like just uncertainty. Gee, I'm not sure which is better. Like, what class should I take next semester? Ooh, these two could be interesting, but I don't know. Which one should I take? That's a Socratic case where you're not really sure which is going to end up being better. But here, I really mean you feel that inner tension, as if you're being torn apart. Different things pulling you in different directions. So what are some examples? It's not something that most of us have to reach hard for. These happen in life all the time. So what are some instances of this? Yeah?
Taking a nap or starting your homework.
Starting your homework or taking a nap. Okay, good. You're tired. It feels like it would be nice to just lie down, but you've got all this work to do. Yeah?
Telling someone a secret.
Telling someone a secret. Good. Somebody confide something in you. Or maybe you're thinking, should I confide in this person? And you feel torn. You really would like to tell somebody, and yet you think maybe it's a really bad idea. Other cases. Yeah.
Watching another episode on Netflix or going to sleep.
Oh, watching another episode on Netflix or going to sleep. Right? It's so dangerous. The next episode just pops up, right? And so, yeah, I try not to watch Netflix much because when I do, it is like this never-ending source of temptation.
Dangerous game to play.
It's very dangerous. It's sort of like this slippery slope into staying up all night. And then you say, what did I accomplish? Oh, I watched all of season 8 of Grey's Anatomy or something. So it's sort of ridiculous. Yeah?
Texting while driving.
Texting while driving. Okay, yeah. You're driving along and somebody's saying, hey, listen, you're late. When are you going to be here? And you'd really like to respond, but on the other hand, you can't easily stop. You're on the highway. You might be tempted to try to respond without, taking your eyes off the road, and you're probably going to, never mind. Bad things will happen. Yes?
Eating a bland apple or having a burger.
Oh, good. Eating an apple or having a burger. You're hungry. And you think, I should just have this apple that I brought with me. But you're right across from In-N-Out, let's say, or Whataburger, and you're thinking, oh man, that would be so good. What it comes down to from Plato is this. Okay, and actually we saw several of those different tensions with Homer in that episode. But now, think about it this way. What's going on there is I might think, oh, I better not eat the donut, either for the sake of my own health or because I don't want my soul to be taken by the devil or whatever. But on the other end, I have a desire for the donut. And so reason might begin conflict with desire. Plato says there are actually three parts. There is the rational element, reason, the part that thinks. There is also the appetitive element, desire. That's the part that wants. And then there is this spirited element, emotion. That's the part that feels. And he says those three parts are parts of our soul that can come into conflict with one another. So he gives us this image of the soul as a chariot, where the driver is reason. The driver is the part that thinks. But there is one horse that is well behaved, that's emotion, the part that feels, the spirited element. But then there is also desire, the appetitive element, the part that wants. And that's the unruly horse that's hard to constrain. So we see this image in art here or there, okay, with reason driving these two horses, emotion and desire. And he says usually reason and emotion are in alliance because the way you think about something and the way you feel about something are closely related. But desire, that's totally independent, and that's hard to control. That tells us there are three potential kinds of desire, and of course there might be combinations of these. It might be reason versus desire. That's the most common type, but it could also be reason versus emotion. It could be desire versus emotion. Now I think it's easiest to see this in a little diagram. If those are the three parts, then any of those pairs are ones where we could have a kind of conflict. We've got reason versus desire. Well, that's very easy to think of examples of. What about reason versus emotion? Can you think of that kind of tension? Yeah. Oh, okay, breaking up with a boyfriend who cheats on you. That might be a case where reason is telling you one thing and emotion is telling you something else. Or then getting back together with somebody like that, reason might be saying, no, don't do it, but emotion is pulling you back, and so forth. What about desire versus emotion? That's maybe the hardest one to think about. Well, here, oh, yes?
Could that be like taking it slow in a relationship versus like just jumping to the light?
Oh, yeah, desire might say go fast, and emotion might be saying go slow in a relationship, so yes, that's one. In fact, that's a much more entertaining and happy one than the one that Socrates talks about in the story. It's about somebody who is crossing a battlefield where there are many bodies. He wants to look at them, but the emotion of disgust fills him and inclines him not to look. And in the end, he says, all right, look, ye wretches, holding his eyes open and forcing himself to look at the dead bodies. Nah, I like your example better. Anyway, what's the solution to this problem? It is controlled by the rational part of the soul. It is vital that reason in the chariot control those horses. That's what is vital. Each part has to play its own proper role. And so it's a balance of the soul, a balance of each part playing its proper role that is crucial to virtue. It is also crucial to happiness. It is crucial to responding to weakness of will. On this conception, weakness of will is a matter of knowing the proper roles, but not being able to control those horses, not being strong enough to force the various elements into their proper roles. Now, I want to conclude by just thinking about, well, blah, blah, blah. Augustine's criticism. He has one crucial criticism. In the end, he says, look, the self really is unified. There aren't different parts. And here is his argument. He uses Plato's own principle against him. Anytime you feel this sort of conflict, then you're supposed to have different parts of the soul. But Augustine says, wait a minute. Reasons can conflict with one another. So can desires. So can emotions. And so, if we really adopt this principle, we'll end up with not 3, but thousands of parts of the soul. Now why? Can you think of cases where desires conflict? Well, he says, sure, it can be good. I want to study, but I also want to volunteer and help the poor. Or it can be bad. I want to steal that BMW, but I also want to steal that Porsche. But I can only steal one. What should I do? Can emotions conflict? Sure. There's one of my favorite poems here. I hate and I love. Why, you may ask? I don't know, but I feel it, and I am in torment. And then what about rational conclusions, reasons? Yes, even they can come into conflict. And so Augustine says, actually, what's going to happen here is we will end up with a million parts of the soul if we go down Plato's path.